Hello and welcome to Module 3. In this module we'll be looking at sports sponsorships. Now the combined work of several academics firmly state that sponsorship is more than just slapping your logo on an event and hoping to get a return. I've identified what I think are the three most important attributes in making sponsorships effective. That's looking at the brand, the fan, and then the brain. In this module, what I'll be doing is I'll be walking you through some of the attributes of a brand that you should be considering when working in sports sponsorships. We'll be tying this back to what we learned in Module 1, discussing how highly identified fans behave in predictable ways when engaging with sports sponsorships. And then lastly, I'll be introducing to you some of the cognitive processes and the theoretical concepts on how people actually become aware and activate with sponsorships. This will enable you to not only identify some of the surface level opportunities in sports sponsorships, but rather engage in critical thinking and better understand how these occur. So, when you're looking at the sports fan and you're looking at sports sponsorships, it's important to identify these engagement opportunities. And again, looking at the brand and the fan will allow you to identify such engagement opportunities. And as a result, when you look at the cognitive processes, you can then predict behaviors that drive fan activation. But first, what I would like to do is talk about sports in the sense of business to set the stage. Sports only make up 1% of live television, sports make up 1% of television program, period. However, they account for 50% of the tweets discussing live television. Year over year, we see mega events attracting more and more audiences and growing in year over year. The nice thing about sports, whether you're working for an organization or a brand and you're trying to figure out where to advertise and sponsor, sports are one of the last live television events that people consume. Take, for example, the World Cup. In 2014, there was a 42% increase in the TV audience size from 2010. Also, looking at the World Cup as an example for these mega sporting events, live television, USA versus Portugal, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, had 18.2 million viewers tuned into a live event. There's not many television programs out there that can garner that type of audience size. And mind you, this is just soccer. This is a sport that once ranked behind tractor pulling. So, sports have also permitted a proliferation of commercialization. And what this has done is it's caused a conflict between sports as a business and sports as a game. You see, the main revenue in Babe Ruth's heyday were ticket sales and concessions. However, today it's TV contracts, merchandising agreements, licensing, online sales, global marketing, upgraded seat options, licensing seat options, and of course your sponsorships and endorsements, and this is all occurring in a global environment. When we look at North America, the total North American sponsorship spending in 2014 was $20.6 billion, and that is projected to increase to $21.4 billion in 2015. Year over year, as you can see from the chart below, from 2011 on, there's been approximately 4% or more in growth in sponsorship spending in North America. When you actually break down sponsorship spending and focus just on sports alone, $14.35 billion of that 20.6 last year was spent on sports sponsorships. And this isn't a trend just unique to the United States or North America. This is happening on a global level. Worldwide, $55.3 billion were spent in sponsorships, and a large section of that, or a large chunk of that, of course, was spent on sports. So let's talk about how we can maximize this potential. And hopefully this will give some of you an edge if you work for an agency or an organization that's thinking about how to use sponsorships to promote a brand or generate more income. When we look at the brand, there's 3 things you need to consider. Number 1, congruence. Number 2, prominence. And number 3, articulation. Let's talk a little bit about these in greater depth. As Johann Pham in 2001 said, there should be a semantic relationship that many consumers should exist between the events and between the company. So when we break this down and put it in lay terms, congruency basically says that there should be a fit between the brand and the event. Okay? Now, what does that mean? There's two different ways that we can look at this. One, we can look at this through functional congruency, meaning if the event is taking place, that the sponsor has some sort of stake in the event for maybe its athletes or its fans. Take, for example, Wimbledon. Wilson makes tennis rackets. It's functionally congruent. It's part of the tennis game. It's part of the sport, much like Adidas would be part of soccer. Functionally congruent. You can also articulate the congruency, and this is going to be based on a brand image level. Wimbledon's as an image is usually looked at something that is very highbrow, luxurious, sort of a everything's clean, pristine event. Rolex has that same sort of brand image. Therefore, there's a nice congruency between Rolex's brand image and Wimbledon's brand image. Research shows that brand event congruency can increase recall, meaning afterwards you can ask people, hey, which sponsors do you remember being at this event? And they'll be more likely to remember the congruent ones. It also affects the affective response, meaning people tend to like congruent brands with congruent events. To them, it seems more genuine, it seems like it makes sense, and therefore they're a little more accepting and appreciative of it. And then lastly, behavioral. Research shows that people are more likely, if they are fans or engaged in that event, that they're more likely to naturally consume or activate with the brands that are congruent to that event. There's a similar sense of taste and behavior, so it makes sense on a surface level. Let's look at some other examples of what happens when you have really nice congruency between the event and the brand. Adidas is synonymous with soccer. And in 2014, Adidas was pretty much the digital winner of the 2014 World Cup. They had 1.7 million mentions. That was 22% higher than all competitors. And the reason why is because they were congruent. It's a prominent brand, and they were really good about articulating their involvement in the sport and appealing to highly identified fans. I'll be putting online a case study about Adidas and the sponsorship that I would like to encourage you to read. This sort of like extra reading and understand how this occurred. So that takes care of congruency. Remember, congruent brands are better for sponsors. The next thing to look at is prominence. Prominence means that usually one brand is going to be bigger in the marketplace than the other. And typically what happens is people are going to use simple heuristics when making choices. First, they're going to think of what the congruent brands were, what made sense to be there. And then they're going to think of the two that were there, what is probably most likely to be the biggest brand. Usually this is based on prior behaviors and who has the market share. Typically what it boils down to is people think of who had the money to be at this event, or who's the prominent person in this market. So let's say, for example, there was an event where a soft drink was going to sponsor it, and people saw a red can. When walking out, just for instance, pretend it was Sam's Choice Cola. When you ask people on the way out who was the sponsor, most of them are going to say Coca-Cola because it's a leader in the market and it sponsors a lot of events already. So you have to be aware. If your brand or if the brand that wants to sponsor is lower in the market, it's going to be much more important to make sure you articulate that connection. Otherwise, the competitors who have higher market share are going to reap the benefits. Let me provide you another example. For my dissertation, I looked at how sponsors were activated inside of a kind of a niche sport looking at the UFC. And I chose this because I figured a lot of people wouldn't know about the brands associated with it, and they wouldn't know about the sport. This was to test to see if people can make those congruent connections on themselves, and then also understand how exposure and prominence and all these factors worked, and it's something that was less familiar. So what I did is, you'll notice the picture on the left, I stripped all brands and logos out of the picture. On the picture on the right, not only did I maintain that clean, no brands, no sponsors, no anything, except for in the call out on the bottom. I put the UFC is proudly sponsored by, and then I put a very obvious sponsorship opportunity there, the logo. What I noticed through this was what I like to call the tap out effect. Now, if you're familiar with the UFC organization, you may have seen this logo, the tap out logo. Tap Out's probably one of the most prominent brands inside of mixed martial arts. They were one of the first apparel companies to be a part of the sport. They were frequently seen as sponsoring the sport. And here's what's funny about this. Despite not being shown, over 50% of the people said that they saw this sponsorship. All right, here's a little trick. When people were shown these ads, nowhere was tap out ever shown. So no one ever saw a tap out, yet 50% of the people said that they did. What's even funnier is when we looked at it, 16% of the people who said that they were certain that they saw the top out logo, 16% of them weren't even shown a sponsor, period. So, if you're really big in the market space and people just assume you belong there, you don't even have to spend the money to be there, and people will give you credit for being a sponsor of that event. That's prominence. Now, lastly, I'll bring you to articulation, how you communicate your brand presence. Crimmins and Horn said it best in 1996, if the brand cannot afford to spend to communicate the sponsorship, then the brand cannot afford the sponsorship at all. So this goes back to our first point. It's more than just slapping a logo on the side of a billboard, but rather you must articulate your sponsorship, particularly if you're not fully a congruent sponsor. Let's give you an example. Castrol, they're a motor oil company, but they were one of the biggest sponsors of the 2014 FIFA World Cup. Now, throwing this billboard in the background wasn't going to be nearly effective in getting people to recognize, recall, and like Castrol motor oil. So what they did is they proposed some sort of on-site activities. They allowed people to engage with the brand through an event. However, this still wouldn't be effective in reaching everyone. Keep in mind, this is a global event and not everyone is there on site. So what they did is they articulated their relationship by providing what they called the Player Performance Index. And this objectively ranked players' performances because, after all, it's liquid engineering to give you a better performance. They articulated what their brand promise was, that we're about performance, we're about movement, we're about indexing and measurable results. By the way, look, we're giving you something to show results and performance and looking and tying it to what these sports players are doing or these athletes are doing. What's really nice about this is what the sponsor did is they gave a tool to engage the fans. Highly identified fans were more likely to log on to this performance index online, and they were able to see what their players were doing, their favorite players, how they were performing of their favorite teams. And, of course, you're exposed to the Castrol logo 3 times on this screen, along with there's some information before and after you close this app. So, what they've done is Castrol didn't just say they were part of the sponsorship. They gave the fans something to be engaged with. They gave them a promise. They gave them a way to engage and activate with the brand and articulate their connection. And when you look at who won the Sponsorship World Cup in terms of return on their investment, mentions, and recall, obviously number 1 is Adidas, but number 2 is Castrol, beating out Nike and some of the other prominent sponsors. So, when looking at the brand, know that 1, congruence is favorable. 2, prominent brands are going to do better in the marketplace, and you need to be aware of prominent bias. And 3, you must articulate your connection to the event and try to find some way of doing more than just throwing your logo on the side of a panel. Alright, let's look at sports sponsorships and looking at fans. We've already talked about highly identified fans and fan identification in the previous module. Really, we've given you the insights and behaviors of highly identified fans. I've given you some ways that you can understand how highly identified fans work and provide some deep analysis. And what you need to understand that highly identified fans are very predictable for sponsorship activation. Highly identified fans, like I've said before, are more knowledgeable of congruent sponsors, and they're more able to sense the goodwill or the abuse of a sponsorship. In tune with that, just really know every research study that's been published has shown that highly identified fans are more likely to purchase the sponsor. They may not always like the sponsor more than less identified fans, but they're more likely to purchase it. And lastly, sponsorship is a science. Like I said, it's not just throwing your logo up there, but there's a certain process that happens that enables people to actually make this work. Now, this is a very complex model. When you go through the readings, you'll hear us mention all of these. I'm not going to walk through all this because this can be very daunting, but it's important that you see this to understand that there's a lot of different moving pieces that affect one another and influence one another in order to get to your outcomes that you'll notice there on the bottom right of the screen. The model that I proposed and that I've been studying for the last couple of years is how fan identity really engages all this. It causes a physiological response, meaning our sense of arousal and attention is impacted. And then within there, there's a lot of different individual factors. There's a lot of different ways our brain works. And then there's, of course, the market factors such as prominence and congruency. And all three of these main hubs are interacting with one another. But let's simplify this for you guys to get you to better understand this. And if this is something that's interesting to you, please come see me. I'd be more than willing to share more readings that go in a little bit greater depth here. But what you need to be aware of, there's a nice simple 7-step model. And when we look at the last three, well, there's a nice simple step of 3 here, beginning with simple awareness, and then ending with reciprocity, which is on the bottom there, meaning people will pay for the brand. If we look at the affiliation, implied size, and implied endorsement, this is really the hub of what we introduced today. Affiliation, looking at fan identification, implied size, looking at the articulation, and then the tap out is looking at your prominence, the implied endorsement. When we look at the first 3 of the models, here's a couple things that you need to understand. Simple awareness, number 1, fans are 10 times more likely to correctly recall a congruent sponsor than low identified fans. Meaning highly identified fans are going to be more aware than less identified fans. If there's a correlation between the event and the sponsor, there's going to be a direct effect transfer. Meaning if you like the event, you're most likely going to like the sponsor that's associated with it. It's sort of like if you have a friend that you really like and they have a friend that they really like, chances are you may really like their other friend just out of, oh, well, if he likes him, he must be a pretty good guy. Then there's an image transfer. Vicarious achievement on the field transfers to winning for the brand among highly identified fans. Much like we talked about with fan identity, when your team wins, there's a lot of burgeoning, there's a lot of success. The brands that are associated with winning teams also receive those benefits, and they are seen as being brands that are more successful for picking winners as well. Looking back at Module 1, affiliation, fans will act within accordance of the group, demonstrating their desire to be affiliated with the group. The reason that fans buy or engage with brands that sponsor events and teams that they like is that they want to be part of the group. Research has shown that even if a fan may not like a certain brand, they're more likely to buy it if everyone in the group also is buying it. If you remember in Module 1, I had the bow tie and the red jacket. I'm not a fan of bow ties or red jackets. However, that's what a lot of people in the group were wearing. I bought it even though I didn't like it so I could be part of the group. Implied size, lastly, the more you spend articulating your endorsement up front will make it core to the highly identified fans. Looking at the cash flow, for example, you need to give highly identified fans something that they can use, a tool, something that encourages them to activate and work with the brand rather than just see it as a picture on the side of a billboard. And then once your brand is very prominent in the marketplace, it's very prominent within the event, people know that it exists, then people will then begin just to assume that it's there even if it's not. And if you go through this thing of going from simple awareness to people liking it, to people wanting to buy it because it's part of the group, to it's big enough to where it just receives the benefit for being there even though it's not, you then get to reciprocity, meaning people will buy the brand, pay it favorable attributes. So, when you are a fan, your football team is your life. It's important that you articulate congruency among highly identified fans in a group identity to increase likelihood for sponsorship success. And that is the end of this module. Be sure to complete the readings posted in Module 3. If you have any questions or would like to see more readings, please feel free to contact me. I'll be more than happy to help. Thank you very much.